Yeah, right. You mentioned so many issues there. But I mean, I think I'm going to take issue with it's not the responsibility of the design of it. It's to create the affordances, because what you've described as affordances are precisely those created by the context, and the context is conditioned on the agent. When you're referring to the mindset that you have as a user, that is precisely created by the affordances of the entity in which you're about to interact with. So whose responsibility is it? If it's not the designer of the thing which you're interacting with, there's nobody else.
No, there is a whole ecosystem. There is the marketer, right? This thing doesn't exist only, it exists as a something that the company told you it can do, and you need to know what it does. So, for example, if it's a bank, right, then you should know that it can do 2 or 3 things, right? It can give you the balance. It will ask you about your account, gives you A, B, and C, and D. So therefore, so this is my stand. I just want you to help me, make it a little bit more robust or deconstruct it and all. My thinking is, I need to know when I launch a voice bot, I need to have a goal. I need to. This is what I would like to do, right? And this is and how and what it does should be communicated to me before I get into the conversation. But go ahead, tell me.
I think the last line you just basically said, the designers need to give me the affordances. I mean, you're describing a use case. And of course, a use case is bounded in some way, but it's not bounded in language necessarily. It's bounded in the conceptual framework associated with the knowledge and the information that's within the use case, but it's not bounded in terms of what you can do with language. There's plenty of evidence that when people call services and end up talking to somebody, there's a huge amount of social in exchange. You mentioned things like greetings, and apart from all that, again we did some studies on travel planning, and people who are making inquiries of a travel planning service feel obliged to explain why they're traveling to a human being who's providing the knowledge. There's absolutely no need to do that, but people do it. It doesn't inform the transaction, but it is serving other purposes, which are to do with social interaction between human beings. All of that would be both irrelevant and potentially totally confusing to any automated system, because this automated system has no interest in that, and a human
being would not start saying these things to if they knew that it was a bot, right? They would
exactly. We have evidence that's exactly what happens. People are very focused because but it's precisely because of the affordances. You seem to be suggesting that it's outside of the affordances, but it's precisely the affordances and the communication of the affordances which conditions the users to behave in that particular way when they realize it's not a human being. So how do they know it's not a human being? If they hear a human voice, it's very hard to convince yourself. Okay, I mean, even with Alexa, it's uncanny, right? You get that odd feeling even when you're I bet when you're asking for the time or the weather. I bet you also simultaneously have a sort of feeling of slight uncomfortableness, because I think your brain is saying, this device I'm interacting with isn't quite what I think.
And that's why I don't like when it says, "Good morning, Ahmed." Like, who are you?
Yeah, exactly. I saw you posted that, and I agreed with that.
I just don't like it.
No, it shouldn't be expressing opinions.
Yeah, right? And also, why do you tell me good morning? I don't know. Maybe I'm just too radical about this. I don't. Maybe it's useful. Like, I don't know whether it's morning or not. Or good evening.
I think you can circumscribe the sort of things which are inappropriate. I mean, any opinions. It shouldn't use the word "I," right? Because it doesn't exist as an "I." So there's, there are things like that which, and these are the responsibilities of the designers. That's definitely where these responsibilities sit.
Well, let me just make sure that I have communicated precisely what I have in mind. What I object to is this notion that here's a skill, launch it with zero expectations, almost, right? And let the voice bot tell you what it can do. That's sort of the thing that bothers me, because you launch a skill, you know that it's related to a brand. I mean, I've seen this over and over again. We have launched a skill, the city of Minneapolis skill, launch it. Also, I mean, I never do that I don't just approach a person and start talking to them without knowing why I'm talking to them. Like, there's always some kind of a relationship that's sort of pronounced in terms of that mediates our conversation. So I go with a purpose, and I have a sense of what I want from the person, and I have a sense of what they can do and what they cannot do. And that's what I mean by I come in with these pre-conversational concepts and so forth. And it feels to me that a lot of these skills don't acknowledge that basic fact of conversations. That's what I meant, really.
I was thinking back to what you said about the sort of generation of young people who are drawn into join the teams and become conversation designers or something, what have you. We've got a bit of an issue here, I think, which is that first of all the technology is being supplied by these massive global corporate bodies. They have, of course, invested huge amounts in their infrastructure, and they have fantastic tool sets which allow anybody to knock up a skill, even students. And the tools are amazing. I mean, they are fantastically integrated, but within those tools is embedded a very naive and simplistic view of what language is. And a very naive and simplistic view of how people interact. And that's almost inevitable, right? Because of the nature of how they put these things together. And so then you have people who may or may not know anything about spoken language behavior, probably very little, who become skilled at using these tools. And so they're operating entirely within the space of what's been defined to be possible. They probably have no HCI training, and why would they? They don't need to. They need it because they're using these tools.
And also because they are competent conversational speakers, right? So they think that they know how to design. Just
part of it is that. Part of it is that.
No, I'm sorry, interrupted you.
Well, no. I mean, I think we're in agreement here. So we've got a lot of people who are in the business of making these skills, who perhaps don't fully understand the nuances of what's actually going to be involved when people start to interact. I remember seeing on, I think it was LinkedIn just a couple of weeks back, one of my contacts who's in that domain put up a conversation design for, well, it doesn't matter what it was, but I want to identify the person. Anyway, they put up this chain of sequence of the user says this, the system says this, and asking for people to comment. And people were saying, well, it's fantastic, it's a beautiful flow. And I found myself chipping in rather unpopular. But how does the user know to say these things?
Yes, that's exactly the point. Exactly. How do they know?
How do they know? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I reminded them of a paper published by MIT back in the 1990s, I think, where they studied users' responses to a yes/no question, where it was all set up for them. They had to say yes, right? And I think there were 198 different ways of saying yes, including the word no. And that just showed that the richness and expressivity of spoken language. People use this in interaction. and naive assumptions that if you ask a yes/no question, you're going to get yes or no, or even some arbitrary speech which contains yes and contains no as an intent is potentially quite naive.
Well, let me ask you this. Talking about naive, right? And also, you mentioned that there are lots of bubbles out there at the beginning of the conversation. Folks doing interesting robotics and just interesting stuff, but not knowing that other folks are doing stuff related to what they're doing, that they should leverage all that. So, I mean, there's a lot of great work. There was this conference a couple of days ago where you gave the keynote. And there's a lot of work, really good work in academia. And it feels to me that the industry, meaning folks like me who are not in academia and folks who are designing and all that, are just not aware as much as they should of all the great work that's being done. So there is a sort of, again, this reality of bubbles between the two. So for example, there is there is somebody who has a website, and she posts about voice first events, right? Like for example, Lingofest, which is what we are doing here. So I communicate with her, let her know about all these things we're doing, and she posts on the website and so forth. But all of those are from folks like me in the industry. But I didn't see, for example, announcements of this particular session, a 2-day session that I think a lot of folks could have benefited from the industry, to start addressing some of that naivete, right? Understanding that, and a lot of people are walking around thinking that this is a brand new field, to be honest with you, right? And they are trying to reinvent the wheel in a very bad way, from scratch, not knowing that there's been a lot of thinking, a lot of research and so forth, so that, if they knew, they would read those papers, they would engage with the folks and start from that baseline instead of doing things in an amateurish way. So, I mean, do you see that as well? That these bubbles?
Yes. Yes. Very much so.
What do you propose we could do to bridge that?
Yeah, this is a really hard problem. I've grappled with this.
Yeah.
My nature is an interdisciplinarian, so I take an interest in many different fields. But of course, academia typically doesn't do that. Academia typically focuses and narrows and gets into extreme specialisms, and that's exactly what we see in this space. So there are many. Even academic communities looking at this. I think I said at the start, there are
exactly.
We've only got one thing here that people are, in principle, ought to be interested in, but we've got all these different communities, and so one of the bigger communities, which is somehow, I think, fairly disconnected from others, is the HCI community, which is huge, absolutely huge, and yet speech is barely features in that community. I know of a few colleagues who are enthusiasts and try to push it into that area, and yet a lot of what we're talking about ought to be central in there, in that community, and so yes, we've got some big disconnects. And the other aspect which troubles me, and but which drives my own particular research, is that we seem to be lacking sort of fundamental principles which underpin any of this. So we talk in general terms about interaction and affordances and what have you, but my training originally, I'm an engineer, and in the end I want to understand a mechanism, and I want to have some principles on which to base that mechanism. I don't want to just hack. I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm not a hacker. I don't like the idea of just hooking bits of code that does stuff together. That to me is not principled. That is a potential solution. But as an engineer, I want to know what the underlying principles are. What's the physics of all this?
So the disconnect, there's an equivalent disconnect. So HCI is, where voice is just like, maybe somebody here and there likes it. Same thing with UX in the industry, right? UX is very visual, gooey, and then you have people here and there who are, who are tinkering with voice. And the irony, I think, is that to solve the voice and speech problem, we need to have multiple disciplines. We need to have linguistics. We have to have conversation analysis. We need to have all kinds of folks who come in to solve this problem. How do you propose? Like, you're an engineer, I'm an engineer too, actually, and so we're always looking for solutions. What would be the solution to this bubble issue? Perhaps just going and advocating and building bridges.
Well, that's what I tried. That's what I tried to do.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a big problem, and I think it comes back to where we started. Spoken language is the most sophisticated behavior of the most complex organism in the known universe.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be surprised that there are so many different aspects to this that actually, even if we got all those people in the same room, we all ourselves have different languages, different ways of describing this problem. Creating something coherent, it may be this is just a very, very, very big problem, which makes it very, really exciting. I'm so pleased I'm in this field.
Yeah.
because we're tackling something really, really important. And but it may be that if we're aspiring to think, well, okay, let's just have a big international conference, look at all the different disciplines, bash a few heads together, and we can crack this. I suspect that's not going to happen. We've got to somehow build up a base of fundamental principles, which is where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably know I've started this series of workshops trying to create interdisciplinary connections between people who are working with animals and robots and human beings. Vocal interactivity in and between humans, animals, and robots, VIHAR. And just a few weeks ago, we had the third workshop, and I think we had over 200 people registered. So there's people interested, but they're all doing very different things. I haven't seen in these workshops yet anything kind of emerging in the middle ground, which is why I started this series, aiming at the sort of general principles. So,
yeah. No, I was going to ask you, where would one go to find out more about this particular initiative?
That's all on the web. Yeah, in fact, the last one was online. All the proceedings are online. It's all open and available. Just look up VIHAR, VIHAR.
VIHAR. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
But as I say, it's an interesting group of people who are in principle trying to communicate, but I would say it's not happened yet, and we've been going since 2016. But there's an attempt there to try to draw some of these things together, and you'll notice that it's not spoken language that we're mostly talking about. I've limited it to vocal interaction.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I was just saying many animals use sound to communicate.
Yeah.
And so it's back to back to basics is where I think the action should be, which is where are our models of these very basic interactions that we see in living systems that ought to be providing the foundations on which we build the superstructure, aiming ultimately towards spoken language. At the moment, we've got these amazing technologies at this very high level, but really founded on sand. And the evidence for that is not just these usability issues which we've been focusing on, but of course the other issues is the phenomenal amounts of training data that are being used to calibrate these systems. The contemporary machine learning is very powerful and has had a huge impact on increasing performance of things like automatic speech recognition. But the amount of speech that these systems are trained on is ridiculous in comparison to how much you and I have been exposed to even in our lifetime, let alone what a child is experiencing. And that just shows us that there is an underlying inefficiency in our technology right now. And people involved, building those systems will probably say, well, so what? We have access to all this data, let's use it. Well, absolutely. But on the other hand, there are now beginning to be ecological issues to do with the GPU farms that are used to train these systems, taking huge amounts of energy. So maybe we should be worried about the energy the efficiency of that approach.
That and maybe we are wasting time, right? That could be used to figure out how to solve these problems with a lot less data, right? Maybe this there is a solution, and the resources we're spending on collecting the information and all that and building these neural nets, maybe that's misguided. Maybe there's an opportunity cost to that.
Well, and there are people. I'm not unique here. I mean, there are people who are taking that view, and there are people taking these vast systems and showing that actually they can, by transfer learning, do more or less zero shot learning on new systems, on new problems. So that's there's a lot of it. There's not nothing going on there. It's just that what's ending up in the market it represents a particular strand.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about the hundreds of millions of dollars that could be diverted, if we want to say it that way, to help those folks who are trying to solve it without all this footprint that is very costly to us. Anyway, we could be talking for hours and hours, Professor Moore. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Where should one go to find out more about you other than typing your name? Is there specifically somewhere where you'd...
well, I do have a website in which if you type my name, you'll find it. You need to put the K in, otherwise you get some rather well-known actor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I use that. He starred in something called The Saint, right? Is that right?
Yeah,
Roger
right.
Moore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
You wouldn't believe the fun I have when I check into a hotel.
Yes. But I think it's all good though.
Some people even think that I haven't noticed.
I know. I mean, isn't that interesting? They think that this is the first time that they're coming up. Human beings are quirky. Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Social interaction.
It's social interaction. Thank you so much, Professor Moore. I enjoyed my conversation.
Nice to talk to you.
You bet.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you.
All the best. Yeah.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.